What lies beneath the ice? In January 1997, a brutal winter storm sealed off a small Missouri town from the outside world. Roads became death traps. Power lines collapsed. Families huddled inside, waiting for the storm to pass. But when the ice finally melted, investigators discovered something far more chilling than the weather. A 5-year-old girl had vanished. No body. No witnesses. No answers. Just a stepmother whose story kept changing, and a father who was hundreds of miles away when his daughter disappeared. This is the case of Savannah Driscoll, and what happened to her remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in Missouri history. Before we go any further, I need you to do something critical. Hit that subscribe button right now. Cases like Savannah survive because people like you refuse to let them fade into darkness. Every like, every comment, every share pushes this investigation back into the spotlight where it belongs. Join the Cold Case Crime Lab community today, and let's make sure Savannah Driscoll's name is never forgotten. Now, let's dive into what really happened that winter. January 1997. Platt City, Missouri sat trapped under the weight of a Midwestern winter that had turned brutal. Ice storms were nothing new to this part of the state. They rolled in from the plains with predictable cruelty, coating everything in thick layers of frozen precipitation that transformed familiar landscapes into alien terrain. Trees bent under the weight until their branches snapped. Power lines sagged and broke, plunging neighborhoods into cold darkness. Streets became impassable corridors of black ice that even the most experienced drivers avoided. Schools closed. Businesses shuttered. Emergency services warned residents to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. The storm that arrived in mid-January 1997 was particularly severe. Meteorologists had been tracking it for days as it built strength over the Rockies, pulling moisture from the Gulf and cold air from Canada. When these systems collided over the Great Plains, they created the perfect conditions for what weather experts call an ice storm event. Freezing rain fell continuously for more than 36 hours, accumulating at a rate that overwhelmed municipal response capabilities. Salt trucks couldn't keep up. Plows were useless against ice. The Missouri Department of Transportation issued a no-travel advisory for Platt County and surrounding areas, effectively isolating communities from one another and from emergency services. Platt City itself was small, home to fewer than 3,000 residents. The town occupied a modest stretch of land along Interstate 29 in Platt County, positioned approximately 25 miles north of Kansas City. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by first names and last names and often middle names too. Where gossip traveled faster than official news. Where the local diner served as the unofficial town hall, and the parking lot of the Casey's General Store functioned as a social hub. Daily life moved according to rhythms dictated as much by weather and agricultural seasons as by calendars or clocks. The town's economy relied primarily on agriculture and the service industries that supported it. There was a grain elevator on the south side. A John Deere dealership. A handful of churches, Baptist and Methodist mostly. A small downtown area with a post office, a bank, a hardware store, and a few storefronts that changed hands every few years. Most residents either farmed or worked in Kansas City, making the commute down 29 when weather permitted. It was a quiet place. The kind of community where people generally trusted their neighbors and where violent crime was rare enough to be shocking when it occurred. And it was here, in this tight-knit, isolated, fundamentally decent community, that 5-year-old Savannah Marie Driscoll was last seen alive. Savannah lived with her father and stepmother in a modest single-story ranch house on the eastern edge of town. The property sat back from the road on a quarter-acre lot, bordered by bare oak trees that in winter looked like skeletal hands reaching toward a gray sky. Snow-covered fields stretched beyond the property line on two sides. The house itself was unremarkable. Vinyl siding in a shade of beige that had faded over the years. A single-car garage attached on the north side. A small front porch with wooden steps and peeling white paint. A gravel driveway that in winter became a frozen minefield of ruts and ice patches. Inside, the layout was simple and typical of ranch homes built in the 1970s. The front door opened directly into a living room furnished with a couch, a television on a stand, and a coffee table cluttered with magazines and remote controls. The living room flowed into a kitchen with linoleum flooring, oak cabinets, and appliances that had seen better days. A narrow hallway extended from the living area, leading to 3 bedrooms and a single bathroom. At the end of the hallway, a door opened to a wooden staircase that descended into an unfinished basement used primarily for storage and laundry. The house was clean but showed signs of financial constraint. Furniture that was functional rather than stylish. Carpeting worn thin in high-traffic areas. Windows that let in drafts during winter. It was the home of working people who earned modest incomes and spent carefully, maintaining what they had but unable to afford upgrades or luxuries. Andrew Driscoll was 34 years old in January 1997. He worked as a long-haul truck driver for a regional freight company called Midwest Transport, a mid-sized operation that moved goods across the central and western United States. Andrew's routes typically took him through Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and sometimes as far west as Nevada or as far north as the Dakotas. The work required him to be away from home for extended periods. A typical run might keep him on the road for 10 to 14 days at a time, during which he would sleep in his truck, eat at truck stops, and communicate with home only through occasional phone calls from payphones along his route. People who knew Andrew described him as hardworking, reliable, and emotionally reserved. He was not a man who shared his feelings easily or who formed close friendships readily. He showed up for work on time, completed his routes without complaint, and kept to himself. Co-workers at Midwest Transport said he was professional and competent but distant. He didn't participate in the casual banter that filled the break room. He didn't attend company events or socialize after hours. He simply did his job and went home. Andrew had grown up in rural Missouri, the son of a farmer who worked land that had been in the family for 3 generations. He left school at 17, before finishing his senior year, to work construction because his family needed the income. He spent several years doing physical labor, framing houses, pouring concrete, working in all-weather conditions for hourly wages that barely covered his expenses. When he was 23, he transitioned into trucking because the pay was better and the work, while demanding, was steadier than construction. He obtained his commercial driver's license through a training program offered by a trucking company, completed his certification, and began driving regional routes. Over the next decade, he built a reputation as a dependable driver who met his deadlines and took care of his equipment. Andrew had married his first wife, Michelle, in 1989. They were both young, Andrew 26 and Michelle 23. The wedding was small, held at a Baptist church in a town near where Andrew had grown up, attended by immediate family and a handful of friends. They moved into a rental house in Platt City shortly after the wedding, drawn by the town's proximity to Kansas City and its affordable cost of living. Their daughter, Savannah Marie Driscoll, was born on March 14, 1991. She arrived after a difficult pregnancy that had required Michelle to be on bed rest for the final 2 months. Savannah was a small baby, just over 6 pounds at birth, but healthy. She had dark hair like her father and large brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. In early photographs, Savannah appeared as a serious child, rarely smiling for the camera, her expression thoughtful and watchful. By all accounts, the marriage between Andrew and Michelle was troubled almost from the beginning. Michelle struggled with Andrew's long absences on the road. She felt isolated in Platt City, where she knew few people and had difficulty making friends. She suffered from depression, a condition that worsened after Savannah's birth. Andrew, for his part, seemed unable or unwilling to provide the emotional support Michelle needed. He responded to her distress with silence and withdrawal, spending even more time on the road to avoid conflict at home. The marriage deteriorated over the next 3 years. There were arguments about money, about Andrew's work schedule, about Michelle's mental health, about how to raise Savannah. Michelle accused Andrew of being absent even when he was physically present. Andrew accused Michelle of being unstable and impossible to please. The fights escalated. Neighbors occasionally heard shouting coming from the house late at night. Once, police were called for a domestic disturbance, though no arrests were made and both parties denied that any physical violence had occurred. In the spring of 1994, Michelle left. She packed her belongings while Andrew was on a trucking run, loaded everything into her car, and drove away. She did not take Savannah with her. According to later statements, Michelle believed she was incapable of caring for a child in her mental state. She thought Savannah would be better off with Andrew, who at least had steady employment and could provide material stability. Michelle moved back to her parents' home in southern Missouri, several hours away from Platt City. She maintained minimal contact with Andrew and saw Savannah only sporadically over the following months. The divorce was finalized in November 1994. Andrew was granted full custody of Savannah. Michelle agreed to the arrangement without contest. The divorce decree stipulated that Michelle would have visitation rights, but these were loosely defined and rarely exercised. Michelle struggled with her mental health, cycled through a series of low-wage jobs, and eventually lost touch with her daughter almost entirely. By 1996, Michelle had stopped calling or sending birthday cards. For all practical purposes, she had disappeared from Savannah's life. Andrew now faced the challenge of raising a young daughter as a single parent while maintaining a career that required him to be away from home for extended periods. The solution he arrived at was not uncommon among truck drivers in similar situations. He began looking for someone who could provide childcare during his absences. What he found was Kristen. Kristen Renee Holloway was 28 years old when she met Andrew Driscoll in the summer of 1995. She had grown up in a small town in Kansas, the youngest of 4 children in a family that struggled financially. Her father worked in a meat processing plant. Her mother cleaned houses to supplement the family income. Kristen's childhood was marked by instability. The family moved frequently, chasing work and cheaper rent. Kristen attended multiple schools, never staying in one place long enough to form lasting friendships or achieve academic success. She dropped out of high school during her junior year and left home at 17. Over the next decade, she worked a series of low-skill jobs, waitressing, cleaning, cashiering at convenience stores. She moved around the Midwest, living briefly in Kansas City, Omaha, and several smaller towns. She had relationships with men that tended to be short-lived and volatile. She had no children of her own and no criminal record beyond a couple of traffic violations and one arrest for shoplifting that was dismissed when she agreed to pay restitution. By 1995, Kristen was living in Kansas City, sharing an apartment with a roommate and working the night shift at a 24-hour diner. She was attractive in a hard-worn way, with bleached blonde hair, sharp features, and a thin frame maintained more by smoking and stress than by any intentional effort. She had a quick smile that didn't always reach her eyes and a manner of speaking that could shift rapidly from charming to defensive depending on the situation. Kristen met Andrew at the diner where she worked. He was a regular customer, stopping in during the early morning hours when he passed through Kansas City on his routes. They struck up conversations during slow periods when the diner was nearly empty. Andrew appreciated that Kristen didn't ask too many questions or demand too much emotional engagement. Kristen appreciated that Andrew had steady work and seemed stable compared to the men she typically dated. Their relationship developed quickly. Within a few months of their first meeting, Kristen had moved out of her apartment in Kansas City and into Andrew's house in Platt City. She quit her job at the diner and took on the role of caring for Savannah while Andrew was on the road. There was no formal arrangement, no contract or written agreement. Andrew simply paid Kristen a weekly amount for household expenses and childcare, and Kristen managed the home and looked after Savannah during Andrew's absences. Andrew and Kristen married in a civil ceremony in February 1996, less than a year after they met. The wedding was purely practical, undertaken primarily so that Kristen would have legal authority to make decisions regarding Savannah in case of emergency while Andrew was away. There was no celebration, no honeymoon, no announcement to extended family. Andrew filed the necessary paperwork, and they signed the marriage certificate at the courthouse. Kristen became Savannah's stepmother in the eyes of the law. Neighbors who observed the household during this period noticed that the dynamic seemed functional but not warm. Andrew remained emotionally distant. Kristen appeared to fulfill her duties but showed little genuine affection toward Savannah. The child herself seemed quiet and withdrawn, more so than would be expected for a girl of her age. She didn't play outside often. She didn't have friends who came to visit. When neighbors saw her, she was usually alone, standing in the yard or sitting on the porch, watching the street with that same serious expression she'd had as an infant. There were occasional signs that things might not be entirely well within the household. A neighbor later recalled hearing raised voices coming from the Driscoll house one evening, though she couldn't make out what was being said. Another neighbor mentioned seeing Kristen grab Savannah roughly by the arm while loading groceries from the car, jerking the child hard enough that she stumbled. But these observations were fragmentary and easy to dismiss at the time. Everyone assumed that the Driscoll household, like many others, had its tensions but was managing well enough. Savannah attended kindergarten at Platt City Elementary School during the fall semester of 1996. Her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patricia Henderson who had been teaching for more than 20 years, later described Savannah as a quiet, compliant child who rarely caused problems but also rarely engaged fully with classroom activities. Savannah completed her assignments without complaint but showed little enthusiasm. She didn't participate in class discussions. She didn't raise her hand to answer questions. During recess, she tended to stand apart from other children, watching them play rather than joining in. Mrs. Henderson noticed that Savannah often appeared tired. There were dark circles under her eyes. She sometimes fell asleep during quiet reading time. When Mrs. Henderson asked if Savannah was getting enough sleep at home, the child simply nodded and didn't elaborate. Mrs. Henderson also observed that Savannah's clothing, while clean, was often ill-fitting and worn. Her lunches were minimal, usually just a sandwich and maybe a piece of fruit. Mrs. Henderson began quietly supplementing Savannah's lunch from her own supplies, slipping the child an extra granola bar or a juice box. In November 1996, Mrs. Henderson noticed bruising on Savannah's upper arms. The bruises appeared to be finger-shaped, as if someone had gripped the child tightly. When Mrs. Henderson gently asked Savannah how she had gotten the bruises, Savannah said she had fallen. Mrs. Henderson was not entirely convinced by this explanation, but she also had no concrete reason to suspect abuse. Bruises on children were not uncommon. Kids fell, bumped into things, played roughly. Mrs. Henderson made a note of the observation in her private records but did not file a formal report with Child Protective Services. The fall semester ended in mid-December 1996. Savannah attended school through the last day before winter break. She received satisfactory marks on her report card, meeting grade-level expectations in all areas but excelling in none. Mrs. Henderson wrote a brief comment noting that Savannah was a cooperative student who would benefit from more active participation in class activities. The report card was sent home with Savannah on the final day of school. It was never returned with a parent signature. Winter break began. Schools closed for the holidays. Most families in Platt City settled into the familiar rhythms of Christmas preparations, shopping, decorating, gathering with extended family. The Driscoll household was quieter. Andrew was scheduled for a long haul that would keep him on the road through Christmas and into the new year. Kristen and Savannah were left alone in the house. There are no reliable accounts of how Savannah and Kristen spent the holiday period. Neighbors saw little of them. No one reported seeing Christmas decorations at the Driscoll house. No one recalled seeing Savannah playing outside in the snow that fell intermittently throughout December. The house remained dark most evenings, lights visible only in the kitchen and one bedroom. Andrew returned home briefly on December 30, 1996. He had completed his route ahead of schedule and had a few days off before his next assignment. According to his later statements, Savannah seemed fine when he arrived home. She was quiet, but she had always been quiet. She didn't complain of any problems. Kristen reported that everything had gone smoothly during his absence, that Savannah had been well behaved, that there had been no issues. Andrew spent New Year's Eve at home. The household did nothing special to mark the occasion. They watched television. They went to bed early. The next morning, January 1, 1997, Andrew prepared for his next run. He was scheduled to haul a load from Kansas City to Denver, then pick up another load in Colorado Springs and bring it back to a distribution center in Omaha. The entire trip was expected to take 12 to 14 days, depending on weather and road conditions. Andrew left the house early on January 2, 1997. He hugged Savannah goodbye, a brief, awkward embrace. He told Kristen he would call when he reached Denver. He climbed into his truck and drove away. It was the last time he would see his daughter alive. The ice storm that would define the next chapter of this story began to develop on January 7, 1997. Meteorologists tracking weather systems across the central United States noted the convergence of a low-pressure system moving east from the Rockies and a mass of Arctic air pushing south from Canada. The collision of these systems over the Great Plains created ideal conditions for freezing precipitation. Warnings were issued. Residents were advised to prepare for hazardous conditions. The storm arrived in Platt County on the evening of January 8. It began with rain, ordinary and cold but not yet freezing. As temperatures dropped overnight, the rain transitioned to freezing rain, coating every surface with a thin layer of ice. By morning on January 9, trees were encased in ice. Power lines sagged under the weight. Roads became skating rinks. The freezing rain continued throughout the day, accumulating at a rate of approximately 1/4 inch per hour. By evening, ice accumulation exceeded 1 inch in many areas. Tree branches began snapping under the weight. Power outages spread across the county as ice-laden lines broke and transformers failed. The storm continued through January 10. Freezing rain fell intermittently, adding to the ice already coating everything. Emergency services struggled to respond to calls. Ambulances and fire trucks couldn't navigate the road safely. The Missouri Department of Transportation issued a no-travel advisory, urging residents to stay home unless facing a life-threatening emergency. Platt City was effectively cut off from the outside world. Phone lines, already stressed by ice accumulation and falling trees, began failing. Cellular service, limited in rural areas even under normal conditions, became unreliable. Inside the Driscoll house, Kristen and Savannah were alone. There are no witnesses to what occurred during these days. No one saw them. No one spoke with them. The house sat isolated on its quarter-acre lot, surrounded by ice-covered fields and trees. The driveway was impassable. The road in front of the house had not been plowed or treated. Anyone inside would have been trapped, unable to leave even if they wanted to. The storm began to subside on January 11. Freezing rain tapered off, replaced by ordinary cold. Temperatures remained below freezing, but no new precipitation fell. The ice that had accumulated over 3 days remained, however, coating everything in a thick, frozen shell. Roads remained impassable for several more days while crews worked around the clock to clear major routes first, then secondary roads, and finally residential streets. By January 14, conditions had improved enough that some limited travel was possible. Schools remained closed. Many businesses remained closed. But emergency services were operational again, and residents were no longer advised to shelter in place. Power had been restored to most areas, though some rural properties remained dark. It was on January 15, 1997, that someone from Platt City Elementary School attempted to contact the Driscoll household. School was scheduled to resume on January 20, and the office was calling families to confirm students would be returning. The call went unanswered. This was not particularly unusual. Many families were still dealing with storm damage, or they might simply have been away from the phone. A second call was placed on January 16. Again, no answer. A note was made in the school records, but no further action was taken immediately. Teachers and administrators were overwhelmed with storm-related issues and preparations for reopening. A single unanswered call did not raise immediate alarm. On January 17, Mrs. Henderson, Savannah's kindergarten teacher, happened to drive past the Driscoll house on her way home from running errands in town. She noticed that the driveway had not been cleared. Ice and snow remained untouched, with no tire tracks or footprints visible. The house appeared dark even though it was late afternoon, a time when lights would typically be on. Mrs. Henderson felt a small flutter of concern but told herself she was probably overreacting. The family might be staying elsewhere, with relatives perhaps, waiting out the aftermath of the storm in a house with more reliable heat or power. But the concern nagged at her. That evening, Mrs. Henderson called the school office and spoke with the principal, mentioning that she had driven past the Driscoll house and it appeared unoccupied. The principal agreed to follow up but suggested they wait until Monday, January 20, when school resumed, to see if Savannah appeared. If she didn't show up for class, they would take additional steps. January 20 arrived. School reopened. Students filtered back into classrooms, buzzing with stories about the storm, about days without power, about trees that had fallen in their yards. Mrs. Henderson took attendance in her kindergarten class. Savannah Driscoll was absent. Mrs. Henderson marked her absent and continued with the day's lessons, but her earlier concern returned, sharper now. After school, Mrs. Henderson reported Savannah's absence to the principal. The principal attempted to call the Driscoll household. The phone rang but went unanswered. The principal then checked records for an emergency contact number. There was a number listed for Andrew Driscoll's employer, Midwest Transport. The principal called and asked to speak with Andrew Driscoll, explaining that his daughter had not returned to school and the school had been unable to reach anyone at home. The dispatcher at Midwest Transport explained that Andrew Driscoll was currently on a route and would not be back in the area for several more days. He was driving through Colorado at present and was not easily reachable except through the truck CB radio or by leaving messages at truck stops along his route. The dispatcher offered to try to get a message to Andrew, asking him to call the school. The principal thanked the dispatcher but felt that the situation required more immediate attention. She contacted the Platt County Sheriff's Office and explained the situation. A 5-year-old child had not returned to school after the ice storm. No one was answering the phone at the child's home. The father was out of state on a trucking route. The mother, according to records, was not involved in the child's life. The only adult believed to be responsible for the child was the stepmother, and her whereabouts were unknown. A deputy was dispatched to the Driscoll residence to conduct a welfare check. Deputy Mark Sullivan arrived at the house at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon on January 20, 1997. He drove slowly up the ice-covered driveway, noting that it had not been cleared and showed no signs of recent vehicle traffic. He parked his patrol car in front of the house and approached the front door. The house was quiet. Curtains were drawn across the front windows. Deputy Sullivan knocked on the door and announced himself. He waited. No response. He knocked again, louder this time, and called out that he was with the sheriff's office and conducting a welfare check. Still no response. Deputy Sullivan walked around the perimeter of the house, looking in windows where curtains allowed a view. The interior appeared dark and undisturbed. He saw no signs of anyone moving inside. He returned to the front door and tried the handle. It was locked. He made a note of his observations and returned to his patrol car to call for guidance. The sheriff's office instructed Deputy Sullivan to wait at the location in case someone returned home. He waited for approximately 90 minutes, sitting in his patrol car, watching the house as daylight faded. No one arrived. No lights came on inside. At 6 o'clock, Deputy Sullivan was instructed to return to the station. The case was assigned to a detective for follow-up. Detective Laura Brennan was a 12-year veteran of the Platt County Sheriff's Office. She had worked her way up from patrol deputy to detective, earning a reputation as thorough and persistent. She was assigned the Driscoll case on the morning of January 21, 1997. Detective Brennan's first step was to review the information available. A 5-year-old girl, last known to be in the care of her stepmother, had not been seen since before the ice storm. The stepmother was not answering the phone or responding to attempts at contact. The father was on a trucking route out of state. The biological mother was estranged and had not had contact with the child in more than a year. Detective Brennan attempted to reach Andrew Driscoll through Midwest Transport. The company was cooperative, providing contact information and agreeing to relay urgent messages. A message was sent to Andrew asking him to call the sheriff's office as soon as possible regarding a matter concerning his daughter. Detective Brennan also began attempting to locate Kristen Driscoll. She ran Kristen's name through databases, looking for recent activity. There were no recent credit card transactions. No recent traffic stops. No hospital admissions. Kristen's vehicle, a 1989 Ford Taurus registered in her name, had not been reported as involved in any accidents or violations. Detective Brennan returned to the Driscoll residence on the afternoon of January 21. She was accompanied by Deputy Sullivan. They knocked again, called out again, received no response again. Detective Brennan made the decision to enter the house. Given the circumstances, a missing child and an unresponsive household, she believed there was sufficient justification for a welfare entry. Deputy Sullivan forced the front door. The lock was old and gave way easily. Detective Brennan entered first, calling out as she stepped inside. The house was cold. The heat was not running. The interior temperature was probably in the low 40s. Detective Brennan moved through the living room, scanning quickly for any signs of distress or struggle. Everything appeared orderly. The couch was neatly arranged. The television remote sat on the coffee table. Magazines were stacked in a pile. She moved into the kitchen. Dishes were washed and stacked in the drainer beside the sink. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Detective Brennan opened it. Inside were normal contents: milk, eggs, condiments, leftovers in plastic containers. Nothing appeared spoiled or out of place. She continued down the hallway to the bedrooms. The first bedroom, clearly Andrew and Kristen's, was tidy. The bed was made. Clothing hung in the closet. Kristen's belongings, makeup and toiletries, were arranged on the dresser. It did not appear that anyone had packed in a hurry or cleared out their possessions. The second bedroom was smaller, set up as an office or storage space. There was a desk with papers scattered across it, bills mostly, and a filing cabinet. Nothing unusual. The third bedroom was Savannah's. Detective Brennan paused in the doorway. The room was small, painted a pale pink that had faded over the years. There was a twin bed with a worn comforter. A small dresser. A few toys scattered on the floor, a stuffed bear, some plastic figurines. On the wall, a poster of a cartoon character, faded and curling at the edges. Detective Brennan stepped into the room. The bed was unmade. Clothing lay in a pile in the corner. She opened the dresser drawers. They contained a child's clothing, shirts, pants, underwear, socks. Everything seemed normal. She returned to the hallway and noticed the door to the basement. She opened it and descended the wooden stairs. The basement was unfinished: concrete floor, exposed ceiling joists, walls lined with shelving units holding storage boxes and old furniture. A washer and dryer sat against one wall. Detective Brennan moved through the space slowly, looking for anything out of place. Nothing jumped out at her. The basement was cluttered but not unusually so. There were old paint cans, holiday decorations, boxes labeled with years and contents. Detective Brennan made a mental note to conduct a more thorough search if necessary, but for now, nothing in the basement suggested foul play or distress. She returned upstairs. The house was empty. There was no sign of Savannah. There was no sign of Kristen. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no obvious evidence of violence or forced entry. The house simply appeared to be unoccupied. Detective Brennan and Deputy Sullivan exited the house and secured the door as best they could, given that the lock had been forced. Detective Brennan made notes on her observations and returned to the office to continue her investigation. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Later that evening, January 21st, Andrew Driscoll called the Platt County Sheriff's Office from a truck stop in western Nebraska. He had received the message from Midwest Transport and was calling to find out what was happening. Detective Brennan took the call. She explained the situation carefully. Savannah had not returned to school. No one had been able to reach Kristen. A welfare check at the house found it empty. Andrew listened in silence. When Detective Brennan finished, there was a long pause before Andrew spoke. He said he didn't understand. Kristen should have been home with Savannah. Everything had been fine when he left. He had talked to Kristen on the phone just a few days ago, before the ice storm hit, and she had said everything was okay. He didn't know where they could be. Detective Brennan asked Andrew for any information that might help locate Kristen. Did she have family in the area? Friends she might stay with? Places she liked to go? Andrew's answers were vague. Kristen's family was in Kansas, he thought, but he didn't know exactly where. She didn't have close friends that he knew of. She mostly stayed home. He couldn't think of anywhere she would go. Detective Brennan asked about Savannah. Did Savannah have friends or relatives she might be with? Andrew said Savannah's mother, Michelle, lived somewhere in southern Missouri, but they hadn't had contact in over a year. He didn't have a current phone number or address for her. Savannah didn't have other relatives in the area. His own family was scattered across Missouri and didn't have regular contact with Savannah. Detective Brennan asked if there had been any problems at home before he left. Any arguments? Any signs that Kristen might be planning to leave? Andrew said no. Everything had been normal. He didn't understand what could have happened. Detective Brennan told Andrew that he needed to return to Platt City as soon as possible. Andrew said he would abandon his current load and head back immediately. Detective Brennan ended the call and made notes on the conversation. Over the next 24 hours, Detective Brennan worked to locate Kristen Driscoll through every means available. She contacted Kristen's last known employer, the diner in Kansas City where she had worked before moving in with Andrew. The manager said Kristen had quit more than a year ago and they had no current information. Detective Brennan tracked down a phone number for Kristen's mother in Kansas. She called and spoke with a woman who identified herself as Linda Holloway, Kristen's mother. Linda said she hadn't spoken with Kristen in several months. They were not close. Kristen called occasionally, usually when she needed money, but there had been no recent contact. Linda had no idea where Kristen might be. Detective Brennan asked if Linda knew anything about Kristen's stepdaughter, Savannah. Linda said she had never met the child. Kristen had mentioned being married to a truck driver and taking care of his kid, but Linda had never visited and Kristen had never brought the child to Kansas. Detective Brennan asked Linda to call immediately if Kristen made contact. Linda agreed. Detective Brennan also reached out to neighboring counties and law enforcement agencies, circulating a description of Kristen Driscoll and her vehicle. She filed a missing persons report for both Kristen and Savannah, though at this stage, it was unclear whether they were missing together or separately, or whether they were in danger. Andrew Driscoll arrived back in Platt City on the afternoon of January 22, 1997. He went directly to the sheriff's office and met with Detective Brennan. He appeared shaken and confused. Detective Brennan asked him to walk through everything that had happened before he left on his trucking route. Andrew's account was straightforward. He had returned home briefly at the end of December. Everything seemed fine. Kristen said there had been no problems while he was away. Savannah seemed okay, quiet like always, but okay. He spent New Year's at home, then left on the morning of January 2nd for his next run. He spoke with Kristen by phone a few times during the first week of January. She said everything was fine. The last time he spoke with her was on January 6th, the day before the ice storm began. She said Savannah was doing well and they were preparing for the storm, stocking up on food and batteries. Detective Brennan asked if Kristen had mentioned any plans to go anywhere or visit anyone. Andrew said no. She never mentioned anything like that. She usually stayed home. She didn't have a lot of friends or social activities. Detective Brennan asked about Kristen's relationship with Savannah. How did they get along? Andrew hesitated. He said they got along fine as far as he knew. Kristen took care of Savannah. She made sure the child was fed and clothed and got to school. She wasn't, Andrew paused again, she wasn't warm exactly, but she did her job. Detective Brennan pressed. Had there ever been any indication that Kristen was rough with Savannah? Any signs of abuse or neglect? Andrew said no, not that he had seen. He admitted that he was gone a lot, so he couldn't know everything that happened when he wasn't home. But Savannah had never complained. She had never shown signs of being afraid of Kristen. Detective Brennan asked Andrew to go through the house with her to see if anything was missing or out of place. They drove to the Driscoll residence together. Andrew walked through each room slowly, looking carefully. In the master bedroom, he noticed that some of Kristen's clothing was gone. Not all of it, but several items. Her winter coat was missing. Her purse was gone. A small suitcase that usually sat on the top shelf of the closet was missing. In Savannah's room, Andrew noticed that her favorite stuffed animal, a bear she slept with every night, was missing. Some of her clothing also appeared to be gone, though it was hard to say for certain. Detective Brennan asked if Kristen's car keys were anywhere in the house. Andrew looked and couldn't find them. This suggested that Kristen had left voluntarily, taking some belongings with her. But where had she gone? And had she taken Savannah with her? Detective Brennan obtained a recent photograph of Kristen from Andrew and began circulating it along with Kristen's vehicle description. A 1989 Ford Taurus, tan in color, Missouri license plates. Alerts were sent to surrounding states. On January 23, Detective Brennan received a call from a clerk at a gas station in Topeka, Kansas, approximately 60 miles south of Platt City. The clerk said a woman matching Kristen's description had been in the station 2 days earlier, on January 21. She had paid cash for gas and purchased cigarettes. The clerk remembered her because she seemed nervous and kept looking out the window at the parking lot. The clerk hadn't seen a child with her. Detective Brennan drove to Topeka and interviewed the clerk in person. The clerk confirmed the sighting and provided a description that matched Kristen. The clerk checked the security camera footage from January 21. The footage showed a woman who appeared to be Kristen entering the store, purchasing items, and leaving. She was alone. No child was visible in the footage or in her vehicle when she drove away. This was the first confirmed sighting of Kristen since the ice storm. It placed her in Kansas on January 21, alive and apparently mobile. But it did not answer the critical question, where was Savannah? Detective Brennan returned to Platt City and briefed her supervisor. The case was escalating. A child was missing. The stepmother, who should have been caring for that child, had been seen alone in another state. The circumstances were deeply suspicious. On January 24, Detective Brennan received another call. This one came from a motel manager in Wichita, Kansas, approximately 200 miles southwest of Platt City. The manager said a woman matching Kristen's description had checked into the motel on January 21 and was still there. The manager had seen the missing persons alert and thought it might be the same person. Detective Brennan immediately contacted Wichita police and requested assistance. Officers were dispatched to the motel. They located Kristen Driscoll in room 114. She was alone. There was no child with her. Kristen was taken into custody and transported to the Wichita Police Department for questioning. Detective Brennan drove to Wichita, a journey of approximately 4 hours, and arrived at the police station late in the afternoon on January 24. Kristen waived her right to an attorney and agreed to speak with Detective Brennan. The interview was recorded. Detective Brennan began by asking Kristen where Savannah was. Kristen's response was immediate and seemingly unconcerned. She said Savannah was with friends. Detective Brennan asked which friends. Kristen said she didn't remember their last names. It was a family from Savannah's school. They had offered to take Savannah for a few days while Kristen dealt with some personal issues. Detective Brennan pressed. What were the friends' names? Where did they live? Kristen became vague. She said the wife's name was Jennifer or Jessica, something like that. They lived somewhere in Platt City, but she wasn't sure of the exact address. She had dropped Savannah off there before leaving town. Detective Brennan pointed out that no one at Savannah's school had any record of such an arrangement. No family had reported having Savannah. In fact, the school was the one who had raised the alarm because Savannah hadn't returned after the storm. Kristen's demeanor shifted. She became defensive. She insisted that Savannah was fine, that she was with a family who was taking care of her, and that there was nothing to worry about. Detective Brennan asked why Kristen had left town. Kristen said she needed to get away for a while. Things had been stressful. She needed a break. Detective Brennan asked why Kristen hadn't told Andrew where she was going or that she was leaving Savannah with someone else. Kristen said she tried to call Andrew, but she couldn't reach him. She said she left a message with his trucking company, but apparently it hadn't been delivered. Detective Brennan checked with Midwest Transport. There was no record of any message from Kristen. Detective Brennan asked Kristen to provide contact information for the family who supposedly had Savannah. Kristen said she didn't have their phone number. She had just dropped Savannah off and left. Detective Brennan asked when this had occurred. Kristen said it was on January 9, during the ice storm. Detective Brennan pointed out that travel was virtually impossible during the ice storm. Roads were impassable. How had Kristen managed to drive anywhere? Kristen's story began to fracture. She said she had left before the worst of the storm hit. Then she said she had left right after it ended. Her timeline kept shifting. Detective Brennan asked Kristen directly, "Where is Savannah right now?" Kristen said she didn't know. She said Savannah was with the family, and they would bring her back when Kristen returned to Platt City. Detective Brennan terminated the interview and consulted with prosecutors. Based on Kristen's statements, which were contradictory and unsupported by any evidence, and based on the fact that Savannah's whereabouts were unknown, prosecutors authorized charges. Kristen Driscoll was arrested and charged with child endangerment and making false statements to law enforcement. Over the following days, Detective Brennan worked to verify or disprove every element of Kristen's story. She interviewed every family with a child in Savannah's kindergarten class. None of them had taken Savannah. None of them had even spoken with Kristen about taking Savannah. Most of them barely knew who Kristen was. Detective Brennan checked hospitals, clinics, and emergency rooms across Missouri and Kansas. There were no admissions or visits for a child matching Savannah's description. She checked with relatives on both Andrew's and Michelle's sides of the family. No one had seen Savannah. No one had heard from Kristen. Detective Brennan interviewed neighbors near the Driscoll residence. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Ruth Parker who lived directly across the street, provided a crucial piece of information. Mrs. Parker said she had been looking out her front window on the morning of January 9, right before the worst of the ice storm hit. She saw Kristen loading something into the trunk of her car. Mrs. Parker couldn't see clearly what it was, but it appeared to be a large bundle or bag. Kristen seemed to be in a hurry, moving quickly despite the icy conditions. Mrs. Parker watched as Kristen got into the car and drove away. That was the last time Mrs. Parker saw either Kristen or Savannah. Detective Brennan asked Mrs. Parker if she had seen Savannah that morning. Mrs. Parker said no. She had only seen Kristen. This timeline contradicted Kristen's claim that she had left town after dropping Savannah with a family. If Kristen left on the morning of January 9, during the ice storm, when travel was dangerous and most people were sheltering in place, where had she gone? And more importantly, what had she done with Savannah? Detective Brennan obtained a search warrant for Kristen's vehicle, which had been impounded when she was arrested. Forensic technicians processed the car carefully. They found nothing immediately conclusive. No blood. No obvious signs of violence. But they did find several long dark hairs in the trunk that appeared consistent with Savannah's hair. They also found fibers and soil samples that were collected for analysis. Detective Brennan also obtained a second search warrant for the Driscoll residence, this time for a more thorough forensic examination. Crime scene technicians spent 2 days going through the house inch by inch. They used luminol in the bathroom, kitchen, and bedrooms, looking for blood that might have been cleaned up. They found small reactions in the bathroom, near the bathtub, but testing determined it was not blood. It was likely residue from cleaning products. They examined Savannah's bedroom closely. They found nothing to suggest violence had occurred there. They collected hair and fiber samples for comparison. They examined the basement more thoroughly. They moved boxes, checked behind stored furniture, looked for any signs of recent digging or disturbance in the concrete floor. They found nothing. The investigation was stalling. There was no body. There was no crime scene. There was no physical evidence linking Kristen to any act of violence against Savannah. There was only a missing child and a stepmother whose story didn't hold up under scrutiny. Detective Brennan interviewed Kristen multiple times over the following weeks. Each time, Kristen's story changed slightly. Sometimes she said Savannah was with friends. Sometimes she said Savannah was with relatives. Sometimes she suggested that Savannah's biological mother, Michelle, had taken her. None of these stories could be verified. Prosecutors determined that they did not have enough evidence to charge Kristen with anything more serious than child endangerment and providing false information. She was held on those charges while the investigation continued. In early February 1997, Detective Brennan located Michelle Driscoll, Savannah's biological mother, living with her parents in southern Missouri. Detective Brennan drove to the small town where Michelle was staying and interviewed her in person. Michelle was shocked to learn that Savannah was missing. She had not had contact with Andrew or Savannah in more than a year. She had not spoken with Kristen at all. She knew nothing about Savannah's disappearance. Detective Brennan believed her. Michelle was clearly struggling with her own issues, depression and poverty primarily, but there was no indication she had any involvement in Savannah's disappearance. The search for Savannah expanded. Volunteers from Platt City and surrounding communities organized search parties. They walked fields and wooded areas around the Driscoll property. They searched along roads and highways between Platt City and the Kansas border, thinking that perhaps Savannah had been abandoned somewhere. They found nothing. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the Driscoll property and surrounding areas. The dogs alerted in a few locations, but excavation revealed nothing. The alerts were likely false positives, possibly reacting to animal remains or decomposed organic material unrelated to Savannah. Divers searched ponds and retention basins in the area. They found nothing. The investigation was consuming resources and yielding no results. Weeks turned into months. The media picked up the story. Local news stations ran segments on the missing girl. Savannah's photograph appeared on flyers posted throughout Missouri and Kansas. Tip lines were set up. Dozens of tips came in, but none led anywhere. Kristen remained in custody on the child endangerment charges. In March 1997, she was brought to trial. The trial was brief. Prosecutors presented evidence that Kristen had been responsible for Savannah's care, that she had left town without ensuring Savannah's safety, and that her explanations for Savannah's whereabouts were demonstrably false. Kristen testified in her own defense, maintaining that she had left Savannah with a family and that she did not know where Savannah was now. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on the child endangerment charge. Kristen was sentenced to 8 years in prison. It was the maximum sentence allowed under Missouri law for the charge. It was also woefully inadequate given the likelihood that Savannah was dead and that Kristen knew what had happened to her. Detective Brennan did not give up. She continued to investigate, following up on tips, re-interviewing witnesses, looking for any piece of evidence that might break the case open. But nothing emerged. Andrew Driscoll returned to work, driving his routes, living in the house where his daughter had disappeared. He gave interviews to local media, pleading for information about Savannah. He offered a reward for information leading to her recovery. But the leads dried up. Years passed. Savannah's case went cold. Detective Brennan retired from the sheriff's office in 2005. The case was assigned to other detectives, but by then, it was just one of many cold cases in the files. Kristen Driscoll served her 8-year sentence and was released from prison in 2005. She moved away from Missouri, reportedly to somewhere in the Southwest, and disappeared from public view. Attempts to contact her for follow-up interviews were unsuccessful. Michelle Driscoll continued to struggle with her mental health. She died in 2009 from complications related to substance abuse. She never learned what happened to her daughter. Andrew Driscoll continued living in Platt City until 2012, when he sold the house and moved to another state. He refused most interview requests and avoided speaking publicly about Savannah. The loss had broken something in him, and he lived the rest of his life as a ghost of the man he had been. In 2015, nearly 20 years after Savannah disappeared, a team of investigators from a nonprofit organization that specialized in cold cases took another look at the evidence. They reviewed all the police reports, re-interviewed some witnesses who were still alive and willing to talk, and consulted with forensic experts. They concluded that Savannah had almost certainly died in the Driscoll home, likely on January 8 or 9, 1997, during the ice storm. They theorized that Kristen, overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for a child she had never wanted, had snapped. Perhaps there had been an argument. Perhaps Savannah had misbehaved or cried too much. Perhaps Kristen had struck her, harder than intended, and Savannah had died from the injury. The ice storm had provided the perfect cover. Roads were impassable. No one could travel. No one could check on the household. Kristen had time to dispose of Savannah's body, possibly loading it into her car trunk as the neighbor had observed, and driving somewhere to hide it once the roads became passable again. The body had never been found because Kristen had hidden it well, perhaps in a location she had scouted beforehand, perhaps in a remote area where it would never be discovered. This theory fit the evidence, but it remained just a theory. Without a body, without a confession, without physical evidence linking Kristen to an act of violence, it could not be proven. The case remains officially unsolved. Savannah Driscoll is still listed as a missing person. Her photograph, the one taken during kindergarten in the fall of 1996, still appears on websites dedicated to missing children. In the photo, she is 5 years old, with dark hair and serious brown eyes. She wears a blue sweater. She does not smile. If Savannah were alive today, she would be in her mid-30s. She would have lived an entire life. She might have graduated from college, started a career, married, had children of her own. But she never got that chance. Her life was stolen from her, most likely by the woman who was supposed to protect her, in a house that should have been safe, during a storm that cut her off from anyone who might have helped. The Savannah Driscoll case is a reminder of how vulnerable children are, and how easily they can disappear when the adults responsible for them fail. It is a reminder that cold cases are not just files in a cabinet. They are lives interrupted, families destroyed, questions that echo across decades. Savannah deserves to be remembered. She deserves justice. And somewhere, there are answers. Someone knows what happened to Savannah Driscoll. Someone knows where she is. If you have any information about this case, please contact the Platt County Sheriff's Office or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Even the smallest detail, something you saw or heard in January 1997, could be the piece that finally brings Savannah home. This is Cold Case Crime Lab, and we won't stop telling these stories until every question is answered and every missing child is found. If this case touched you, if you believe Savannah's story needs to be heard, then subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video. Leave a comment. Keep this case alive in the public consciousness. These cold cases only get solved when enough people refuse to let them fade into silence. Be that person today. Be the voice Savannah never got to have. Thank you for watching, and thank you for caring enough to listen to her story.